Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. I'm Kim Malinitz, Director of the Negotiation and Dispute Resolution Program.
And I'm Di Canzano. I'm an attorney in the Contractor Responsibility and Conflict Resolution programs.
Have you ever asked what you thought was a simple question and 30 minutes later you were still trying to get your answer? Maybe that person made assumptions about what they thought you wanted to know. Or maybe the way you worded the question prompted a very narrow response and you had to pull out every detail until you had a complete answer. Many times we don't ask enough questions or the right kinds of questions to achieve the best results. This is why we are focusing this webinar on effective questions. Asking effective questions is one of the pillars of effective communication. At its most basic, effective questions give you information you need to perform your work, monitor progress, and support the mission. As a tool in your communication toolbox, it shows you're listening. Questions are a bridge to clarity, respect, and stronger relationships.
We'll start with a very brief review of questions as part of active listening. We will then work on your effective questions, KSAs. K stands for knowing what you want to know and why you're asking. S stands for selecting the right type of question. And A stands for asking the question in a way that will get you what you need. You will also learn techniques for asking effective questions. You'll have a chance to try some of them out and you'll have a practice strategy. As a result, you will be able to spend less time fixing problems that a question could avoid, get to the root cause of conflict, move quicker on decisions, and enjoy stronger relationships for accomplishing the mission.
Questions are usually embedded in a conversation. During that conversation, there's a combination of questions, listening, processing what we learn, and then asking the appropriate follow-up questions. At the end of a conversation, we should understand something we didn't before we began. I'm going to play you two versions of a conversation between Airman Lewis and her second-line supervisor about a project she's been assigned but is late in delivering. Listen for three things. 1, the kind of question that you hear in each version. 2, what the second-line supervisor says or asks in response to the answer he gets. And 3, what the supervisor learns.
Hey, Airman. How's it going?
Good, I think.
Are you almost finished with the draft SOP? I haven't seen anything from you, and it's already past due. Has Deanna seen your progress?
Yes, no. She hasn't had time to meet with me. She's been trying to...
Well, where does the project stand right now? Can you show me any of it?
It's good, really. I'll show you some of it, but I'm waiting on some additional background and...
What do you mean you're waiting on background? There's no excuse for being so late. I want an update by COB. Got it?
What did you hear? Senior Airman Jones says the supervisor just wanted to know about the SOP. Nothing else mattered. Shonda notes those were all close-ended questions, right? So they didn't give the supervisor much information. Juan says the supervisor seems pretty annoyed but isn't giving the airman time to respond. Doesn't seem to want to listen to any excuses. Major Castor notes that the supervisor is learning that the project is late and getting later. That's about it. He's interrogating, asking multiple questions at once, and not listening to answers. Shonda agrees with Juan. The supervisor is not listening, just demanding.
Those are all great observations, and the supervisor really doesn't learn anything he didn't already know before. So let's listen to a different version.
Hey, Airman. How's it going?
Good, I think.
How is that SOP coming along?
We are almost finished. I'm just waiting on Deanna to get me this last part.
Oh, what's that about?
She was at a meeting and heard the commander say he was really interested in this process being used at another base. She's trying to get more information about that to include.
Good thinking. I heard that as well. How can I help? What do we need to get this finished? Others are waiting on us. And you need to let me know when you're going to miss a deadline.
Oh, sorry about that. I won't let it happen again. For now, I'll ask Deanna and let you know where we are.
Okay, but please get back to me by COB at the latest. We good?
What was different here? Alana points out that this was much more of a conversation, and they moved the needle on the project. That's right, Alana. Good observation. So, how do you think the questions supported the conversation? Alana responds, they were open-ended questions, and the supervisor got a lot more information than in the first. Sergeant Ellis added, yeah, and the supervisor learned about the attention to the commander's interest, and where the project was. Mateo says the supervisor hears a lot more and could offer his support. And Alana adds he was interested in the project and getting Airman Lewis in line.
So I want you to be thinking about our two tales here as we go through the webinar. We'll touch on many of the points you've raised. The primary purpose of asking questions is to acquire knowledge, to learn something we don't already know. In fact, asking an effective question is like stepping over a boundary between not knowing and learning. But just like the supervisor in the first example, many of our questions don't always start with that goal in mind. For example, the supervisor asked, "What do you mean you're waiting on background? There's no excuse for being so late." What do you think that question is about? Learning? Probably not. What does it sound like to you? Maybe a little accusatory, maybe an expression of frustration, maybe a little threatening. It's not an effective questioning. Which of the following questions would qualify as a question that leads to new information? A, when do you think you'll have it completed? B, how much progress have you made? C, what in the world were you thinking? D, hey, how's it going? And E, what on earth could be taking you so long? You're right if you're thinking that a lot can depend on the way a question is asked, both in words and tone. In fact, you can have a question that may have a criticism embedded in it, like E, but that still provides some information. And we'll talk later about a more effective way to ask that question so people will be forthcoming in their responses. But what this illustrates is that regardless of our communication styles, we can ask questions that enhance our knowledge. For this exercise, the one question that is not about learning something new is C. What in the world were you thinking? Using questions effectively is one of the basic communication tools that serve us, whether we are in conflict or, as more often may be the case, we need to have a difficult conversation with someone. They also expand our toolbox of techniques that allow us to engage others. I want to share with you how skilled use of questions fits into or relates to several of the most important communication techniques, starting with listening.
Listening actively is both a receiving and an expressive experience. When we're engaged in conversation, we want to learn something. We want the other person to hear what is important to us, and we want them to know we've heard them. The way we do this is by listening for context as well as content, by being aware of the message our body language and tone of voice are communicating, being aware of the emotional responses, both ours and theirs, and using techniques that show we are taking in what is important to the person we're talking with as we consider what's important to us. This is where questions come in, but there are also other techniques. Let's look at a few of those before coming back to questions. First is restating. This is basically repeating, almost verbatim, what you've heard the other person say. And this strengthens the connection because it helps the other person feel affirmed or hear and reconsider the sounds of what they've just said. The second is summarizing. This is where you consolidate what you hear and draw out the key points from what might be a much lengthier statement. And third is reframing. This helps us to move the conversation by framing a conclusion that might not have been seen by the other person speaking. One of the things that makes restatement, summarizing, and reframing work is a little check-in question at the end. You can always ask, is that right? Did I understand that right? Did I get that right? What do you think? That little question connects you to the person you're talking to, keeps you from jumping to conclusions, making assumptions, or reacting in other ways that may have to be undone later. And it gives you the green light to move on either straight ahead or to steer in a different direction.
To make your question effective, you may base your inquiry on what you have just heard. To be effective, your question should build on what has been said rather than your assumptions or other agendas, acknowledge what has been said before introducing a new direction, keep the conversation focused and moving forward, and, as you'll see in a few minutes, should be asked for the purpose of learning something new or reconsidering something previously raised.
I wonder, how many of us stop to think about the kinds of questions we ask? Or, quite frankly, even that there are different kinds of questions. We may ask really good questions, but are they helping us in the way we intend? Are we asking them out of curiosity rather than relevance? Are we asking them out of general rather than specific needs? What do we want to do with the information? Better understand? Learn how we can help? Make decisions? Or potentially reframe a problem so we or someone we're working with can gain perspective? Effective questions are specific to the reason we're asking them and information we need. Different kinds of questions give us different kinds of information.
Consider this variation in the scenario we opened with.
Airman Lewis is one of the strongest members of your team. She's a self-starter and someone who works well with others up and down the chain of command. That's one reason you were a little concerned about her missing her deadline. You can't remember her ever having done that before. Since that conversation, she finished the draft SOP, but it wasn't to her usual standards. Over recent weeks, she's shown up late for work a few times.
Having seen all this, let's review why asking questions now is important before moving on. Let's look at what some commenters think about why you need to ask some question. Colonel Lee says, clearly something's the matter. Airman Lewis's well-being is part of my responsibility. Jamie agrees, you're right. If you're a supervisor, you have some responsibilities here. The quality of the work, the well-being of your team, and don't forget, time and attendance oversight. Marcus adds, even if you're not Airman Lewis's supervisor, you might have some of the same responsibilities, such as if your work was dependent on her, or if you're a friend and concerned about this change in her behavior.
In your comments, several of you are speaking to a theme. You need to know what's going on. You're the one responsible for the project. Let's use that now as a starting point for considering what kind of question you need to ask her.
The following are examples of 6 different types of questions, each with a particular function and purpose. Let's look at each briefly and then come back to our airmen to see which types might be right for this scenario. First type, exploring questions, gives us a general understanding of something before going deeper into specific details. We ask them when we don't know what to ask and want something to build the next question on. Here are some examples from the scenario. How's it going? How's the SOP coming along? What are some other examples of this kind of question you can think of? What's going on? What's the situation? What do you think is important for me to know? The second of the 6 different types of questions are supporting questions, which help us learn how we can help. We ask these kinds of questions when we see someone struggling or seeking our support. Do you remember what the supervisor said in the second version of the example? Right. He said, "How can I help?" What are a few other examples of supporting questions? How would you like me to respond? This is an interesting example. It is both a question of support, but it also helps clarify. Whether you feel committed to or responsible for helping, there are plenty of times when we are presented with a problem and we can't always know what the other person thinks will be helpful. What do you need me to do? This question has the added value of implying a willingness to take action, but not assuming that the person needs or wants you to do anything. Third type of the 6 questions are staging questions. These are logistical. We ask them when we want to optimize conditions for a productive discussion, a good meeting, or clear plan for moving forward. Having observed the changes we described in Airman Lewis's behavior, what might be a good staging question to put to her? Well, here's one. I'd like to check in with you. When's a good time for us to talk? Other useful staging questions include, who needs to be involved? Who has a role in the project? Who else will need to know about what is concerning you? Who do you want to have in this meeting? Staging questions relating to what should be in the agenda include examples such as, what is important for us to cover? How long should we be meeting? What do people need in advance? And questions relating to responsibility and who has it. Which of us will set up the call?
Continuing on to our question types, we have question type 4. These are deciding questions, and they help us understand what decisions need to be made or to enable us to help to make them. We ask them when we're not able to move a decision forward. For example, what led to this decision? What do we need to consider to address your concerns? Or what was the decision-making process you used? The 5th type are transition questions, and these lead us to a deeper understanding about what may be below the surface, such as a root cause. We ask these questions to help shift the perspective. An example of questions to get to the root cause for Airman Lewis might be, what can you think of that might be making it difficult for you? An example of a question to help reset perspective might include, when did your relationship become challenging? Or, how did this used to work? The final question type 6, is energizing questions. These offer insights for you and the other person about a way forward. We ask these questions when we want to inject positivity or focus on strengths. For example, what is working well? What do you like about how this is working now? And what are the strengths of this plan? Some of you might be thinking, what if I have multiple needs? How do I put these questions together? And that's a really great question. Just like in our examples, we all use multiple types of questions when we're in conversation or discussions, and particularly when we're in sensitive or difficult conversations. That's one reason we encourage you to know why you're asking the question and what you want to learn. Taking this little step helps you to avoid assuming the answer. It opens us up to what we hear and what's important, and it creates an interactive dialogue. So let's go back to our scenario and put you into the scene with our airmen.
Listen closely to try to identify the kinds of questions you hear. Make a note of any questions you think work especially well, and note any way you might have asked the questions differently.
Hey, Hallie. How are things going?
Okay, I guess. Just trying to keep up.
Yeah, I got your email last week about your SOP draft. It's not like you to be late. What's going on?
I don't want to bother you with this. It's just been a challenging time.
I don't want to pry, but what can I do to help?
I think I'm going to need some help. Maybe an extension, or maybe someone else to work with me.
How do you think that will work?
I haven't got it all worked out yet.
How about let's sit down and talk this through? When do you have time to grab a coffee?
That's probably a good idea. Now's good.
So what did you hear? Exploratory, right. How are things going? What's going on? Did you notice how these questions gave you more information to build the conversation on? What else? Supportive, right again. What can I do to help? There's a transitioning question. How do you think that will work? And there's even some staging questions. How about we sit down and talk this through? When do you have time to grab a coffee? Here's a comment from James saying he would have wanted to ask another question before asking Airman Lewis to describe how the process would work. He says he'd want to know how her work was being impacted. Good point. So you might have asked at that point, what do you think? An exploratory question? Maybe something like, what kinds of problems are you running into? James is right. This kind of question gets you much more information and might lead to better discussion of options.
Try this out with a fresh scenario. Listen, think about what questions you need to ask and why you want to know.
One of your direct reports has been given a big assignment. He is leading a team of 9 to organize and prepare for a large Air Force-wide conference being hosted at your base. It's a stretch for him, but you believe he's up to it. In addition to managing the team, he also has to collaborate with his counterparts from 4 other bases. You see him working late and have been hearing some grumbling from some on his team. You're concerned that he's overwhelmed.
Some possibilities to explain why the supervisor asked these questions are: it was the supervisor's responsibility to be sure the project is going well, to be sure his direct report has the support needed to be successful, and the supervisor's responsibility to the other members of the team. These may seem obvious, but the brief consideration of what you need to know and why you need to know it helps you think about the kinds of questions you need to ask. How do you think you would start this dialogue? Which type of question? There's more than one way to approach it, but listen to and add your comments about the following dialogue.
Do you have a minute? I'd like to get your input on the conference plans to date.
Sure, what's up?
I have the agenda worked out with the other bases, but it will require a lot of logistical and technical coordination. I'm getting pushback from the team, but I think we really have to do this. I'd just like to see if you see anything I'm missing.
Okay. What's been decided so far?
One of the bases is pushing hard for a multimedia presentation they've invested a lot in developing. I'm getting pressure from their higher-ups and don't really see how to say no. So because of that, some of the team are balking and want me to come up with a less complicated solution. Frankly, I think they are about to wash their hands of it.
What's going on with the team?
I think they're doing pretty well, but they mostly work independently. I only get information from them when I specifically ask for it.
How's that different from how they were working before?
When we started, we had regular meetings and a lot of enthusiasm. Now, most of them don't want to have the regular meetings, and we're having trouble getting on the same page.
Okay, I think I have the picture. What would you like me to do?
Right now, I'd just like your help in thinking this through.
Sure, where do you want to start?
Let's stop here and take a moment to look at the types of questions we've heard so far. How many can you name? Airman Gonzalez points out that there are definitely exploring questions. What's been decided so far, and what's going on for the team? Maya likes the question about how things are different as a way to help figure out maybe where things got off track and to transition to what might bring it back. Mike identifies some supporting questions, questions that don't take over the problem but offer help. What would you like me to do? And where would you like to start? I think you've definitely got the idea of the knowing and selecting part of the KSAs. As we talked about earlier, in order to engage someone in a conversation by using questions, it is important to think about how the question is asked. By this, I'm not talking so much about tone and body language, which are really important, but rather more about how the question is structured and worded to be effective. This introduces the third component of effective questions, asking.
Being clear with yourself about what you want to learn will help you decide what kinds of questions will help you gain that information. You also have deliberate decisions to make in terms of how you ask questions. This is about choosing open or closed-ended questions, selecting the right starter word, using questions as a way to listen to understand and acknowledge the other person, and as a way to listen for information to decide or act. Avoiding the suggestion and assumption trap, otherwise known as loaded questions. Many of you have learned about open-ended questions somewhere during your careers. It's often covered in communication skills training, among others. Open-ended questions are particularly useful for learning from your questions because they almost always require explanatory responses. Closed-ended questions also have their place in our learning, but the amount of information we get is more limited, more specific, and easier to avoid sharing meaningful information. Which way you choose to ask your question depends on how best to learn what you want to know. If, for example, I ask, did you write the new draft SOP? Your answer will be yes or no, a closed-ended answer to a closed-ended question. If I ask you, what was the subject of the SOP? That's still a closed-ended question. You are getting a very limited amount of information. If instead I ask you, how did the SOP you worked on differ from the one it's replacing, you are likely to tell me what the subject is, but much more as well. If the only thing you want to know is the subject of the SOP, then the second question gets that information faster. But if you're thinking about designing some new guidelines for your team based on the new SOP, or you're just trying to start a conversation, then the third example gets you what you want to achieve.
So open-ended questions can be framed for use with any of the types of questions we've talked about, but they're especially helpful in the earliest stages of a conversation when you're trying to expand what you know. So let's work through some examples. For an exploring type question, a closed-ended question sounds like, are you almost ready for your presentation? And we can turn that into an open-ended question by saying, how is your presentation preparation going? For a supporting question, we often ask the closed-ended question, do you need help with your slides? Where if we ask the open-ended question, what kind of help do you need to get your slides ready? That opens up a broader line of communication. Moving on to staging, we may ask a question like, will you have an internet connection on site? Whereas a question like, what kind of technical support will you have available on site, gives us a clearer, larger picture. For deciding questions, we often ask, will a decision be made today? Yet, it may be important that we understand the full process, so we can make that an open-ended question by saying, what will the decision-making process be? For transitioning questions, a closed-ended question sounds like, do you think it would work better to change the order of the slides? To open that up and invite more dialogue, Perhaps it would be better if we asked, how would it be if we rearranged the order of the slides? And finally, for energizing questions, a closed-ended question sounds like, have you made presentations in the past that you really liked? That's a yes or no answer. And we invite better dialogue if we ask, what was the most successful presentation you've made in the past?
Open-ended questions may also be helpful to balancing communication styles. For people who are less expressive, quiet, and possibly more introverted, open-ended questions help you draw them into a fuller conversation. For people who are more expressive and possibly more extroverted, open-ended questions help them consider a more complete response and to focus on complexity they may be racing past. They also encourage a wide variety of responses, expand the available information before narrowing the focus toward a decision or toward action. They bring into focus something previously unconceived, such as a new perspective or possibility. They give you the chance to respond to what the other person believes or assumes. And they build connections with the others that can improve your interpersonal communications.
As you saw in the example above, closed-ended questions can also be used for any type of question, though they will always yield less information and less opportunity to learn from the other person. Closed-ended questions invite closed-ended responses, just as open-ended questions invite open-ended responses. Closed-ended questions are especially useful when you already have a lot of background and need to narrow the discussion in a specific way. In that way, they clarify the essential information from a broader narrative, bring into focus specific data, narrow the information for use in directing and deciding, and provide clarity to the other person about your priorities and decisions.
The decision of whether to use an open or closed-ended question goes back to, why are you asking and what do you want to learn? Open-ended questions are for expanding communication and building the relationship with the other person. Closed-ended questions are for narrowing the discussion. A useful way to ask questions and get a lot of information is to use the kinds of starter words we often think of as those used by newspaper reporters. Who, what, when, where, and how. Some are more useful for expanding the communication. What happened? What would you like to have happened from here? How did things get to this point? Or how are you going to approach this project? Where do you think this is going? Others are specifically narrowing. Who else saw what happened? When did you get here? Or when did they close the meeting? Where have you been?
Other types of questions, like what and how, and sometimes where questions, communicate you're listening to the other person. Who and when, and sometimes where questions, communicate that you are listening for specific answers. Let's try this out. Remember Ehrman Lewis? Create questions that will communicate that you are listening to her. Start your questions with what, how, or where. Lee gave us a question. What do you feel like you can tell me about what's been going on? Ooh, I like Major Zhukov's. How was it for you coming back to work after that? And Raj adds, how can I help? These are all really good. Where is a bit of a tricky one though. How does this work? Where do you think things started? You can see that's a different question than where is used to listen for, which might be, where should we meet to talk about this? So let's try a few examples of listen for questions. Questions that start with who and when. Carl added, who have you told about your concerns? Sergeant Smith contributed, who would you like to have working with you? Major Ortiz also added, when do you think you could get the draft completed if we extend the deadline?
Why seems like such a natural starter question because we want to know what motivates them, what causes them to do certain things, or why they think something has happened. So getting to why is important. Even so, questions that start with why can often sound like an inquisition or an accusation. The challenge in starter words is to find another way to get to why without that real or perceived confronting emotion it may carry. Here are a few examples. So, with the phrase, "Why are you late with the SOP?" you might instead consider a question, "What's holding up completion of the SOP?" The question, "Why did you and Deanna decide to delay the SOP without discussing it with me?" instead could be asked as, "How did you and Deanna decide to delay the SOP without discussing it with me?" Finally, the question, "Why didn't you talk with me about your personal situation? I would have helped," could instead be asked as, "What made you uncomfortable talking with me about your situation? I would have helped."
It can be tempting to use questions to assert or suggest something, rather than using questions to genuinely learn about something you don't know. We call these loaded questions. And the question about loaded questions is, are they really suggestions disguised as questions? And they often express our own untested assumptions about what we think should be. For example, did you consider talking to me about the commander's interests before you delayed the SOP to explore it is both a suggestion of what Airman Lewis should have done and an assumption that Airman Lewis had not considered that conversation. This is an example of a closed-ended question that may be more likely to yield a closed-ended response. Possibly Airman Lewis's response could go something like this: "Yes, I did consider it, but I couldn't reach you." This is an example of a response that is closed-ended. It starts off as defensive because the loaded question communicated judgment, and little additional information came from the response. With these kinds of questions, you're less likely to learn what the real reasons may be.
Here are 2 techniques for avoiding this type of non-question question. First, you could turn your question into a statement. As Airman Lewis's supervisor, you have reason to want to know the reason she didn't consult with you. By making a statement of it, you clarify for yourself what you want to get to in your conversation and can get to your point more directly. Here's an example of making a statement. "It's important for me to be consulted before making a decision to pursue an additional interest and delay the SOP. We need to be responsive, but there were other considerations you were not aware of. How do you think we can adjust the schedule and get back on track?" Another technique for avoiding this type of non-question question is to notice the structure of your question. If the second word in your question is "you," you may be about to ask a loaded question. Could you? Will you? Did you?
In the following scenario, you're about to hear a follow-up of the conversation between Airman Lewis and her second-line supervisor that we started our webinar with earlier. They each ask a lot of questions of each other. Listen carefully to what you think is being communicated in their questions.
Can I talk to you?
Okay, what's up?
Didn't you tell me when you assigned me the SOP that I should take into account the commander's interests and priorities?
Yes, of course. Why are you asking?
I just wanted you to know that that was exactly what Deanna and I were doing, and the reason it was taking us longer to get the draft completed.
Why weren't you doing that all along?
We were, of course, but Deanna came back from an all-hands meeting where the commander talked about the new process he'd seen and—
Did you decide that just because he mentioned an interest in the process, which hadn't yet been tested, you should divert from our timeline without a word to me?
We didn't intend to, but I had a family crisis while you were away, and it took me offline for a while, and—
I'm sorry to hear that. I hope things are okay now. But do you see you need to check with me before you make decisions that impact our projects?
Notice that the tone of this exchange is both defensive and judgmental. The question that starts with why are you asking, why weren't you, communicates assumptions and judgments. Some of the questions that start with did you, didn't you, and weren't you further put Airman Lewis on the defensive.
What else did you notice about the way this conversation went? What did they learn from each other? Matt says, it seems like the supervisor was still pretty mad about the delay in the SOP and made Airman Lewis have to struggle to get her points across. Lieutenant Magistro notes, while the supervisor made assumptions that he knew what Deanna heard and that it wasn't relevant to the project. She might have heard something entirely different. And Jane says, even Airman Lewis's question was a loaded one. Didn't you tell me? Kind of put the supervisor on the defensive as well. Yes, these were mostly close-ended and loaded questions, making it hard for both of them to get what they needed from the conversation. Sergeant Moralia says, well, it was really the tone that stood out for me. When Airman Lewis talked about her family crisis, it was hard for the supervisor to show very much concern. If they'd had a more constructive conversation at that point, he might have been able to ask a question to show his concern. Sergeant Moralia's point really illustrates the importance of how we construct our questions, in that it may be more effective to make statements and then check in to see how that statement is understood, rather than to ask a question we already know the answer to. These kinds of questions help set a tone and make it harder to pivot when the conversation takes a different direction.
Let's listen to the conversation again. This time, both the employee and the supervisor are using more statements and the starter words what, who, when, where, and how. Listen for how the conversation is different.
Can I talk to you?
Okay, what's up?
When you assigned me to the SOP project, I thought you made a point that our product should reflect the commander's interests and priorities. Am I right about that?
Yes, of course. Why are you asking?
I just wanted you to know that that was exactly what Deanna and I were doing, and the reason it was taking us longer to get the draft completed.
What do you mean? I assumed you were doing that all along.
We were, of course, but Deanna came back from an all-hands meeting where the commander talked about the new process he'd seen. He seemed very enthusiastic about how it might apply here. What would you have liked us to do differently?
It is essential that you keep me in the loop, and if you're thinking about changing deliverable deadlines, that you get my okay first. What was it you thought was important enough to move the deadline?
We didn't intend to do that. But I had a family crisis while you were away, and it took me offline for a while. Because Deanna couldn't move forward during my absence, it seemed like a good chance for her to explore this new idea.
I'm sorry to hear about your difficulty. How are things now?
Things are still up in the air, but it's enough under control that I can focus on the SOP.
I'm glad to hear that. What do you think is possible for moving the project forward, and what kind of help will you need from me?
This conversation unfolds very differently than the first. Both the supervisor and Airman Lewis make more statements rather than framing their messages as questions. The supervisor also asked more exploratory questions to better understand the employee's needs. And as a result, they were both able to learn more about what transpired, gain clarity about the supervisor's expectations, and establish a tone that permitted the supervisor to respond to Airman Lewis's personal circumstances in a supportive way.
Everyone can ask great questions. Effective questions are a critical part of active listening, and they require knowing why you're asking a question and what you want to learn, selecting the type of question that matches the information you need to know, and asking questions skillfully opens up conversation, provides more complete and usable information, and builds relationships. In all, improving the effectiveness of our questions improves our ability to stay focused on and accomplish our mission. Regardless of our personality type or communication style, We can learn to get more from our questions by following the techniques reviewed in this webinar. First, ask open-ended questions to gain information. Ask closed-ended questions to act or make decisions. And second, start questions with the tools of information gathering. Who, what, when, where, and how, and sometimes why. And third, convert questions that are built on assumptions, judgments, or are really just instructions into statements that communicate your understanding and expectations.
If you're viewing this webinar without the live chat, or if you have to leave, feel free to email us through our website with any questions. And that website is www.adr.af.mil. Don't forget to download a copy of the slide deck and the one-page quick reference sheet for what we covered here today. For those attending a session with a live chat, your host will be fielding questions and comments for a few more minutes, and we'll be putting a short 5-question feedback poll up. Please let us know what your thoughts are and what you'd like to hear more from us on in the future. Thanks so much, and have a great day.